The dust hung low over the main street like a tired curtain that refused to lift. It was late afternoon in the small frontier town of Ashford, and the sun burned slowly toward the horizon, painting the wooden buildings in shades of copper and gold. People moved quietly along the boardwalks, but every so often their eyes drifted toward the same place. The church steps. A young woman sat there alone. Her name was Sarah Whitfield, though most of the town had stopped using it weeks ago. Now she was simply the girl who had been left behind, the mail order bride no one came to claim. Her small suitcase rested beside her, scuffed from travel. Dust clung to the hem of her pale dress. She had arrived on the morning stagecoach nearly 3 weeks earlier, clutching a letter from a rancher who had promised her a home, a future, and marriage. But the man had never appeared. At first she had waited with quiet patience, believing there must have been some delay. A broken wagon wheel, a sick horse, a storm somewhere along the road. Days passed. Then whispers started. Maybe he changed his mind. Maybe she wasn't what he expected. Maybe he never existed. The town slowly returned to its normal life, but Sarah remained there on those church steps each afternoon, watching every wagon that entered town, every rider who appeared on the horizon. Hope had a stubborn way of lingering even when it was no longer reasonable. Inside the saloon across the street, a group of men leaned against the bar watching through the window. Still waiting, one muttered, another shook his head, poor thing. A third man snorted. If a woman writes letters begging for a husband, she ought to expect disappointment. Laughter followed. But one man sitting alone at a corner table did not laugh. His name was Caleb Turner. Caleb was a cowboy who spent most of his life on horseback driving cattle across open country. His clothes were worn, his hat faded by sun and rain. A thin scar ran along his jaw from a bar fight years earlier. He wasn't known for talking much, but he noticed things other people ignored, and he had been noticing the girl on the church steps. For 3 weeks, every day she sat there quietly, never begging, never crying, never asking anyone for help. Just waiting. Caleb finished his coffee and stepped outside. The heat of the day had begun to soften, and a cool breeze drifted down from the hills. Sarah sat exactly where she always did, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Caleb walked slowly across the street. When his boots touched the church steps, she looked up. Her eyes were tired but still clear. "Yes," she said politely. Caleb removed his hat. Afternoon. Afternoon. He stood there for a moment, unsure how to begin. Finally he spoke. "You waiting for someone?" She nodded faintly. "My fiancé." Caleb glanced down the empty road. "Been a while, hasn't it? 3 weeks." Her voice carried no bitterness, just quiet truth. Caleb shifted his weight. "Mind if I sit?" She hesitated only briefly before nodding. He lowered himself onto the step beside her. They watched the road together in silence for several minutes. Finally, Caleb asked the question no one else had dared to ask. "What if he ain't coming?" The words hung in the warm air. Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied the road one last time before speaking. "I've thought about that, and—" she looked down at her hands. "Then I suppose I'll have to figure out what comes next." Caleb nodded slowly. Most people in town assumed she would eventually leave. But something about the way she said those words told him she might not. "You got family somewhere?" he asked. "Not anymore. Friends, not really. Money, just enough to last a few weeks." Caleb rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well," he said slowly, "that's a mighty tough start." Sarah gave a small smile. "I've had tougher." He glanced at her. "You don't seem the kind who breaks easy." "I try not to." They sat quietly again. The sun dipped lower behind the rooftops. Finally Caleb stood. "Well, I reckon I should let you get back to your waiting." She nodded politely. "Thank you for the conversation." Caleb tipped his hat and walked away. But that night, lying in his small rented room above the stable, he couldn't stop thinking about the girl on the church steps. The next afternoon he returned. Sarah was there again. This time she greeted him first. "Hello, Mr. Turner, Caleb Turner." "Hello, Mr. Turner." He sat beside her again. Still no sign. No, still waiting. For now. The days began forming a quiet pattern. Caleb would finish his work and stop by the church steps. They would talk about small things, weather, travel, the strange habits of frontier towns. Sarah told him she had grown up in a coastal city far to the east. "You must find this place very different," Caleb said. She smiled slightly. "There are fewer buildings, but the sky is much bigger." Caleb liked that answer. After another week passed, Caleb noticed something. Sarah no longer watched the road constantly. Instead, she watched the town. The children playing near the well, the farmers returning with wagons, the life that moved quietly around her. One evening Caleb asked gently, "You still expecting him?" Sarah looked out toward the horizon. "I think I already know the answer." "And he's not coming." Caleb nodded. "I'm sorry." She shrugged softly. "I suppose it's better to know." A long silence followed. Finally Caleb cleared his throat. "Well, that brings up another question." Sarah turned toward him. "What question?" Caleb took a deep breath. "Now what are you gonna do?" She looked at the town thoughtfully. "I was thinking about finding work." "Doing what?" "Anything honest." Caleb chuckled. "That might be harder than you think around here." "I'll manage." He believed her. Still, something about the idea of her struggling alone bothered him more than he expected. For several days he wrestled with a thought that seemed foolish every time it crossed his mind. Finally, one evening he walked to the church steps again. Sarah was preparing to leave. "I found work at the boarding house," she told him, "helping with cooking and cleaning." "That's good." She smiled. "It's a start." Caleb rubbed the back of his neck nervously. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." She waited patiently. Caleb took a breath. "You came all this way looking for a husband." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "That was the plan." "Well," he paused. The words felt heavy. "What if you didn't have to start over with a stranger?" Sarah looked confused. "I don't understand." Caleb stared down at his boots. "I ain't rich. My ranch is small, and half the fence posts lean the wrong way." She listened carefully. "I spend most days chasing cattle that don't want to be chased." A small smile appeared on her lips. "That sounds like honest work." Caleb nodded slowly. "It is." He looked up and met her eyes. "But I've been watching you sit on these steps for weeks. And I kept thinking, if a man lets a woman like you wait alone that long, he don't deserve you." Sarah's breath caught slightly. Caleb continued quietly. "So I figured I'd ask the question nobody else seems brave enough to ask." Her heart began to beat faster. "What question?" Caleb held her gaze. "Would you consider marrying someone who actually showed up?" For a moment the world seemed to go completely still. The wind drifted through the dusty street. A wagon creaked somewhere in the distance. Sarah searched his face carefully. "You barely know me. That's true. And you're offering marriage. I'm offering a chance." Her voice softened. "Why?" Caleb thought about that for a moment. Then he answered honestly, "Because I've seen enough of life to recognize a good thing when it's sitting on church steps waiting for someone who ain't worth the dust on her shoes." Tears shimmered in her eyes. "You're serious?" "As a drought in August." She laughed softly through the tears. Caleb continued, "I ain't asking for an answer tonight." Sarah looked down at her hands. "But you are asking." "Yes." A long silence passed. Finally she spoke. "You asked a question no one else dared to ask." Caleb nodded. "And now I have to answer it." He waited quietly. Sarah looked at the wide western sky stretching over the town. 3 weeks ago she had arrived here expecting a life that never came. But life had a strange way of changing plans. Slowly she turned back to him. "I think," she said gently, "that the bravest question deserves an honest answer." Caleb's chest tightened. "And," she smiled, "yes." For the first time since she arrived in Ashford, Sarah Whitfield stepped off the church steps and walked beside someone who had chosen her not out of obligation or arrangement, but out of quiet, courage, and sometimes, in the quiet evenings years later, she would look back at that dusty road and realize something extraordinary. No one had come for her, until the one man who truly mattered did.